A young medical student walks into a crowded bar on a Friday night and is never seen leaving. Surveillance cameras capture his entrance, but not his exit. How does someone vanish into thin air under the watch of multiple cameras? This is the story of Brian SHAFFER's mysterious disappearance. What really happened inside the ugly tuna saloon that night? It was the night of April 1st, 2006. Columbus, Ohio was alive with music, chatter, and the rush of weekend energy. Inside the bars and clubs near Ohio State University, students were celebrating the start of spring. Among them was 27-year-old Brian SHAFFER, a second-year medical student with a bright future and a warm smile. Brian wasn't just another student hitting the nightlife. Friends described him as ambitious, kind, someone who carried the weight of medical school while still making time for the people he loved. That night, he was with a couple of friends, moving from bar to bar, laughing, drinking, letting loose after a long week of exams. Around 2 a.m., the group ended up at a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloon, tucked into the second floor of a complex along High Street. Security cameras showed Brian entering the bar. He looked relaxed, casual, just like any other young man out enjoying the night. And that's the last clear image anyone has of him. Because while the cameras recorded him walking in, they never caught him walking out. His friends assumed he had left separately, maybe slipped out for air or to head home. But when morning came and Brian didn't answer his phone, didn't show up, didn't call his girlfriend, the worry began to grow. What makes this case so unsettling is the contradiction. In a place full of lights, music, people, and cameras, Brian managed to vanish completely. Police reviewed hours of footage. They studied every exit, every hallway. Still, no trace of him leaving was ever found. How can someone walk into a bar, under surveillance, and never walk back out? That question would haunt his family, his friends, and investigators for years to come. Friends assumed Brian might have slipped away to meet someone, maybe to grab a late-night bite or head back to his apartment. But by sunrise, unease had turned into panic. Calls to his phone went unanswered. His girlfriend, who expected to see him that weekend, couldn't reach him either. By the time his father was contacted, the fear was undeniable. Something was terribly wrong. Police moved quickly, combing through surveillance footage from the Ugly Tuna Saloon. They expected to find a clip of Brian leaving, maybe with the crowd, maybe through a side exit. Instead, what they saw was maddening. The camera clearly showed him walking into the bar around 2 a.m. But when they reviewed every angle, every frame, there was no sign of him walking back out. The building had limited exits, and officers checked them all. If Brian left through the front, the camera would have caught him. If he used the service entrance, there were eyes there too. No matter how many times investigators re-watched the tapes, the same reality stared back at them. Brian walked in, and somehow, he never walked out. This detail turned the case from a missing person report into a haunting mystery. Friends were questioned. Had they argued? Had Brian seemed upset? But everyone described the same thing. He was in good spirits, smiling, enjoying himself. No signs of trouble, no indication he was about to vanish. Search teams scoured the surrounding streets, alleys, even rooftops. They dragged nearby rivers, hoping to find any clue. Yet nothing surfaced. It was as if Brian had been swallowed whole by the bar itself. And so the question deepened, growing heavier with each passing hour. How could a man disappear under the watch of cameras, inside a crowded bar, without leaving even a trace? As days turned into a week, the investigation tightened its focus. Detectives interviewed everyone who had been with Brian that night. His friends explained they thought he'd left ahead of them. They had waited, called his phone, even searched around the bar before heading home, assuming he'd simply slipped away. But now, their casual assumption was starting to look chilling. Police also turned their attention to the cameras again. They slowed the footage down, frame by frame, searching for anything unusual. Could Brian have disguised himself? Maybe walked out wearing a hat, blending in with a group? Could he have slipped behind someone else and gone unnoticed? Every possibility was considered, but the video showed no sign of trickery. The faces and movements were clear. Brian wasn't there. The bar itself became a focal point. Officers searched every corner, from the basement to the roof. They checked utility rooms, stairwells, even the dumpsters outside. Nothing. No trace of blood, no abandoned clothing, no hint that violence had occurred inside. It was as if Brian had been erased. Outside the ugly tuna, search parties grew larger. Flyers with Brian's photo appeared on poles and windows across Columbus. His father, heartbroken but determined, pleaded with the public for information. His girlfriend left desperate messages, begging him to call, holding on to hope that he might still appear. But the silence was deafening. For a young man so full of life to vanish without leaving even a footprint, it defied logic. Each unanswered question seemed to birth another. Where could he have gone? Did someone lure him out of sight? Or was there something far stranger at play? The deeper investigators looked, the more the case seemed to twist into something that couldn't be explained by ordinary means. And that uncertainty began to haunt not just the family, but the entire community. Investigators began to widen the circle. If Brian hadn't walked out of the bar, maybe someone inside knew more than they were saying. They interviewed patrons, bartenders, security staff, anyone who might have seen him after the last confirmed sighting on camera. But the answers were frustratingly vague. Some people thought they'd glimpsed him near the bar's entrance. Others swore they saw him laughing with friends. None of these accounts could be backed up by video, and none explained how he disappeared without being recorded leaving. Theories began to swirl. Some believed Brian slipped out through an emergency exit, but that door was covered by cameras too. Others speculated he might have hidden inside the building, waiting until after closing to sneak out. But exhaustive searches proved that theory wrong. When the lights went up and the bar was empty, Brian wasn't there. Attention also turned to his personal life. Investigators dug into his recent history, looking for clues. Just weeks before his disappearance, Brian's mother had passed away after a long illness. He had been devastated, though he tried to put on a brave face for those around him. Was he overwhelmed with grief? Did he decide to walk away from everything and start over somewhere new? His girlfriend and family dismissed the idea. They said he was planning a trip with her, talking about the future, and still chasing his dream of becoming a doctor. Despite these reassurances, police couldn't ignore any possibility. They checked bank accounts, phone records, emails. Nothing suggested he had planned to vanish. His life simply stopped on the night he walked into that bar. The case was becoming more than just a mystery. It was beginning to feel like a riddle with pieces missing, where every attempt to connect the dots only led to more questions. And the biggest one of all still hung in the air. How do you disappear from a place you never left? The pressure on investigators grew heavier as weeks passed with no trace of Brian. The case was drawing attention not just in Columbus, but across the country. News outlets ran segments showing his smiling face and describing the bizarre circumstances of his disappearance. The public was hooked on the same question haunting police. How could a man vanish in plain sight? Detectives revisited the surveillance footage yet again, searching for flaws. They considered whether Brian could have slipped past a blind spot, maybe blending into a group as they left. But no matter how hard they tried to bend the possibilities, the evidence didn't cooperate. The exits were covered. The timelines didn't match. It simply didn't add up. Meanwhile, his family refused to give up hope. His father, Randy SHAFFER, became a constant presence, working with police, handing out flyers, and appealing for information. His girlfriend continued to call his phone, sometimes letting it ring just to hear his voice on the voicemail. Every unanswered call was a small heartbreak, a reminder that he was still out there, somewhere. Rumors began to circulate. Some people whispered that Brian had staged his own disappearance, overwhelmed by grief and stress. Others speculated darker scenarios, that someone inside the bar harmed him and somehow the truth was being hidden. Each theory only deepened the mystery because none of them could fully explain the facts. The investigation stretched into months, and frustration turned into desperation. Police expanded their search radius, combing through abandoned buildings, rivers, and wooded areas. Dogs were brought in, cadaver teams searched, but still, nothing. It was as if Brian had stepped off the map, leaving only questions behind. For his friends and family, life was frozen in that night. They replayed every moment, every detail, hoping they'd missed something obvious. But the silence after Brian's last sighting only grew louder, and the sense that something extraordinary had happened began to feel inescapable. As time passed, investigators began to shift their focus toward the people closest to Brian. If he hadn't simply walked away, maybe someone in his inner circle knew more than they admitted. Detectives re-interviewed his friends who had been with him that night. They pressed them on details. What exactly did Brian say before he disappeared? Did he mention plans to meet someone else? Every answer came back the same. Brian was happy, relaxed, talking about the future. Nothing suggested he was about to vanish. Attention turned to the staff and security at the Ugly Tuna Saloona. Could someone working there have been involved? Employees were questioned again and again, but no suspicious behavior was uncovered. The bar, despite its reputation as a busy student hangout, had nothing to hide. At least nothing police could find. Meanwhile, speculation outside the investigation took on a life of its own. Some locals believed Brian had been the victim of foul play, and that someone powerful was covering it up. Others floated bizarre theories, that he had found a hidden exit, or even that he was smuggled out in disguise. None of these ideas had evidence to back them, but the sheer impossibility of the case made people desperate for explanations. Adding to the mystery was the lack of digital footprints. In an era where phone records, bank transactions, and online activity usually leave trails, Brian's life went silent the moment he stepped into that bar. No credit card charges, no phone pings, no contact with friends or family. It was as if he had been erased from the grid. For investigators, this silence was maddening. For his loved ones, it was unbearable. Each day that passed without answers deepened the pain. The case wasn't just a puzzle anymore. It was beginning to feel like a haunting, a wound that wouldn't heal, with the whole community left asking the same question. Where did Brian go? As the investigation dragged on, theories multiplied. One of the most persistent was that Brian chose to disappear on his own. Grief from his mother's passing, stress from medical school. Maybe it all became too much, and he walked away to start fresh somewhere else. But those who knew him best pushed back hard against that idea. He had plans. He was in love. He had a future mapped out. To them, Brian vanishing willingly didn't make sense. Others believed something darker had happened. Some speculated that he was attacked inside the bar, and that somehow the evidence was hidden. But the police scoured every inch of that building and found nothing. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no discarded belongings. The bar became almost legendary in the public's imagination, a place where a man could walk in but never walk out. Investigators also looked at the possibility of an accident. Could Brian have slipped away from the bar unseen and ended up hurt somewhere nearby? Search teams checked alleys, construction sites, and drainage systems. Dogs traced scents that eventually went cold. Despite the thoroughness of these efforts, there was no sign of him. Meanwhile, the community's obsession with the case grew. News reports kept it alive, and every detail was dissected by people trying to solve the riddle themselves. Online forums lit up with speculation. Some pointed to suspicious figures seen near the bar, while others believed there had to be a flaw in the camera system. But the more people studied the evidence, the stranger it seemed. For his family, the theories were painful. They didn't want wild speculation. They wanted truth. Every rumor felt like a distraction from finding real answers. Yet, with nothing concrete to hold on to, the story only spiraled further into mystery. And the haunting reality remained. Brian had vanished, and no matter how many eyes searched for him, the truth stayed just out of reach. Months turned into years, but the mystery of Brian SHAFFER refused to fade. Each new lead that surfaced only deepened the puzzle. Now and then tips would come in. Someone claimed to have spotted him in another city, or heard from a man who matched his description. Police followed up every time, but each lead dissolved into nothing. The frustration was endless, the hope raised and dashed again and again. One of the strangest moments came when, years after his disappearance, Brian's phone rang. His girlfriend, who had never stopped trying to call, suddenly heard the line connect instead of going straight to voicemail. For a few seconds, her heart raced. Could it be him? But the call produced nothing more than eerie silence. Investigators later suggested it was a glitch, a phantom ring from the network. Still, for those clinging to hope, it felt like a cruel reminder of what they had lost. Detectives revisited suspects, re-interviewed friends, and checked the original evidence with fresh eyes. Nothing changed. Surveillance footage was combed through again, and still it showed the same unshakable truth. Brian walked into the ugly tuna saloona, but never walked back out. As the years stretched on, the case began to take on a life of its own. Documentaries, podcasts, and internet sleuths all tried to piece together what happened that night. Some believed in elaborate conspiracies. Others thought the answer was simple: an accident, a tragedy, hidden by chance. But no theory has ever been able to tie everything together without leaving holes. For Brian's family, each anniversary brought renewed pain. His father kept up the search until tragedy struck again. He died in a freak accident, never knowing what became of his son. It was a heartbreaking chapter in an already devastating story. And with that, the weight of the mystery only grew heavier, as if Brian's disappearance had become less of a case and more of a ghost story whispered through the streets of Columbus. With time, the story of Brian SHAFFER transformed from an active investigation into one of the most baffling cold cases in America. Police never officially closed it, but the trail grew colder every year. Even so, the case lived on in the minds of those who couldn't let it go. True crime forums dissected the evidence, amateurs rewatched the grainy surveillance clips, and strangers who had never met Brian debated endlessly about what really happened that April night. One of the lingering theories was that Brian slipped out through a construction site attached to the bar, a spot that might not have been fully covered by cameras. Investigators considered it, but even that explanation had flaws. If he left that way, why wasn't there any trace of him afterward? No sightings, no belongings, no evidence that he made it far. Others suggested he could have been targeted, attacked, and removed from the bar in a way too precise for anyone to notice. But again, no proof. The mystery became bigger than the man himself, a symbol of how someone can vanish in a modern world filled with technology, surveillance, and constant connection. To Brian's friends and family, though, it was not just a story. It was an unending nightmare. Every birthday, every holiday, every empty seat was a reminder that he was still missing. Over the years, tips would resurface. A reported sighting in another state. A rumor he had joined a band and changed his identity. A blurry photo of a man on a beach in Mexico who looked vaguely like him. Each time, hope would flicker for just a moment. And each time, it faded as the lead fell apart. The public fascination with Brian's case was fueled not only by the mystery, but by the cruel simplicity of the evidence. One man, one camera, one night, and nothing after. No exit, no goodbye, no resolution. Just a question that has echoed for nearly 2 decades. How do you walk into a bar and never walk back out? Nearly 2 decades later, Brian SHAFFER's disappearance still casts a shadow over Columbus. His story has become one of those cases that refuses to fade, a mystery retold in news specials, podcasts, and late-night conversations among strangers who find themselves fascinated and disturbed by the thought of vanishing without a trace. For those who loved him, the case is far more than a mystery. It's an open wound. His girlfriend eventually had to accept that he was gone, though she never stopped remembering the man who had promised a life together. His brother was left to carry the weight of a family tragedy made heavier by unanswered questions. And his father passed away, never knowing what happened to his son. A heartbreak that seemed to ripple outward, leaving the rest of the family to face the silence alone. The Ugly Tuna Saloon eventually closed its doors, but its name remains forever tied to this story. A bar once known for music and nightlife became a symbol of something darker. The place where a young man walked in, smiled for the cameras, and never walked out. People still ask, did he slip past unseen? Did someone take him? Or did he choose to leave everything behind? Every theory has its believers, but none has evidence strong enough to close the case. And so, the mystery lingers, whispering through time, making Brian's story feel less like history and more like a ghost that refuses to rest. What happened to Brian SHAFFER that night in April 2006? Was he a victim, a fugitive, or something even stranger? Until answers come, the world is left with the same haunting image. A young man captured on camera, stepping into a bar, and then into the unknown.